Welcome back to Son of Chelsea. Daniel Childs here. Hope you're doing really, really well wherever you are watching or listening to this. Very glad to say we've got a brilliant guest on the show today, and that is the author and former Chelsea correspondent Nick Purewal to speak about his new book about Chelsea FC, Sanctioned, the inside story of the sale of Chelsea Football Club. It is an amazing read. There's so much insight, so much new detail about what was one of the most earth-shattering periods in the club's entire history. Monumental change, and one that still is talked about today because it is pretty recent history, especially in kind of football books that I read. It is very, very recent history, and we touch on that in the conversation. Nick was very gracious with his time, so we talk about the inspiration behind the book, when he knew, or at least the moment he felt this was the moment to make this book, speaking to both Abramovich and Todd Boehly post takeover and what that was like, and also a quite funny story about Jim Ratcliffe within that convo as well. So I really do hope you enjoy. Links to the book, either physical or digital, are in the description box below. Have you read the book? What do you think about it? Please do let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the podcast and would like to see more convos like this. Let me know as well. But no more wasting time. Let's just get straight to the convo with Nick right now. So thank you so much, Nick, for joining me. I have to say, and I'm sure anyone who's interviewed you about the book so far is probably going to say this is a standard interviewer thing to say when talking to an author, is to say they really enjoyed the book. But that's an honest thing. I did enjoy the book a lot. Obviously, seeing how you've obviously spoken to other media about this, and it's been out for a little bit now, I've seen some of the reaction from other Chelsea fans like myself. How have you found the reaction to the book? Because, as we'll get into, it is quite a recent book as well in terms of the events it covers.
Yeah, absolutely. No, listen, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I think, from start to finish in this process, I really try to keep Chelsea supporters, fans of the club in mind in my own head. I'm a Coventry City fan, so I can't claim I'm a Chelsea fan. But obviously, I covered the club for a long time. So, if you cover a club regularly, and you get to know the people involved, you kind of want them to do well. If it's people and you like, you obviously want them to succeed. So that kind of rubs off a bit. But absolutely, would never claim to be a Chelsea supporter. But in that process, I was always thinking about, in my mind, what would I want to read in this if I were a Chelsea fan? So if that's come across well, that's great, because that was the main aim. And yeah, no, I think I'm really, really pleased with the reaction. Absolutely delighted, because I was working on this for a really long time where I couldn't really tell anyone at all I was doing it. And as you're sort of going through the process of sort of getting an agent, and then putting a proposal together, and putting that proposal out to publishers, hoping that someone will take it on. There's a lot of sort of heart and mouth moments where you sort of think, oh, I really hope other people see it the way I do, and think it's because I obviously always believed in this, but then you get to that point where you think, oh well, that people will be looking at it, and you think, well, if they don't see it the same way, then that could be difficult. But yeah, I've been very fortunate that it's come together, so it's been great.
As someone who I know extensively not only covered the club, but specifically covered the takeover as it happened during that sanctions period, when was the moment you kind of sat down and felt this is a book, this is a subject I want to pursue and really cover in real detail? Because of course, there are many ways you could cover Chelsea, but was there a specific tipping point that made you think this is it?
Um, yeah, probably. I mean, perhaps not one element, but I know you obviously will remember that time really, really well. And it was so. It was. I mean, it was all encompassing, wasn't it? It was. You couldn't, even if you tried to sort of step away from things, it was impossible, wasn't it? And the news cycle was changing hour by hour, which is something I'd never experienced before in my career. And if even with online news, if you think of a reasonable 3 to 4 cycles in a busy day, it sort of updating all the time was remarkable. And so I think at the point when um, I broke the story about Roman Abramovich trying to help with the peace process, I think that was the kind of point where I thought this is taking on a very different. This takes everything to a completely different level. And then just as everything unfolded, even though a great deal of what was happening was very, very public, there was an awful lot of information that wasn't public at the time as well. So it felt all through the process, it felt like there would be a deeper story to tell. And then it was kind of the back end of sort of autumn into winter 2023 where the idea for the book took hold. Really, yeah, basically, if the main thing really there is the ability to, well, the opportunity to interview Roman Abramovich, and I think without that, it sort of wouldn't really stack up as a book. So that was the point at which the sort of it started to to feel like that would happen. So that was a point where it really sort of came together. But yeah, all the way through the process, there were some stepping stones towards thinking there's a story in here that is much deeper than is coming out in public.
One of the things reading it, of course, when I say recent, in terms of I'm an avid reader of football books, and when you say recent, you think, well, yeah, 2022 is obviously very recent. I was amazed reading it, especially towards the end, how recent it actually gets. I mean, it really does take us up to basically present day Chelsea, which is remarkable, really, for a book. I just, from kind of an author point of view, I assume you had to wait, for the ending of obviously the ending of the 24-25 season, which could have gone in a different way on, both fronts of the Champions League and the Champions League qualification, and also what happened in Rocklaw. So in terms of an author point of view, were you a little bit concerned, on edge kind of, or were you kind of like, what, this is just nice kind of detail?
It was great to be able to squeeze all of that in, and that made it very tight between putting the book to bed and it being published. But I think it's really, I'm really, I have to give massive credit to Bite Back, the publishers, for their agility and ability to work at really high speed, because a lot of that you're talking about, that was edited very quickly, but to an extremely high level. And I mean, this is my first book, and seeing the kind of speed and professionalism of people who are seasoned in the industry is remarkable. So that was a great experience, and I'm really glad and very grateful to them that we managed to squeeze in the information on the closing of the season, because I think in the context of everything that's happening, that's so important, isn't it? I mean, everyone understands, of course, that a book is has to be printed at one point, and then after that things will happen and change. But it's just the way it's fallen, it does kind of feel like um, and this is by default, but does kind of feel like that is the closing of the wider sale chapter, actually, because fingers crossed, Chelsea are on a more even keel now. Not to say that they are where they want to be or where the fans want them to be, but fingers crossed, it's green shoots of a recovery, isn't it?
Yeah, it's symbolically. I felt that, being in Rocklaw and seeing the team lift the trophy, I also kind of felt that was a fitting end to kind of, I guess you'd start it at the Club World Cup in 2022, wasn't it? All the way up to now. And I think that's what the book covers well. One of the things you gain a lot of insight into, and I think it's something that frustrates many Chelsea fans looking at it and just seeing people who have read the book and given their thoughts on it,
Mm.
is about the UK government and the handling of the situation, and specifically whether you refer to it as incompetence or just bureaucracy of politics. It is kind of your perspective. But I was maybe not so in the moment, because of course, as you alluded to earlier, it was so frantic and you were moving from one story to the next. But really reading a lot of this was a sense of a government that didn't quite grasp, I guess, the severity that these sanctions would have on a football club, not just any football club, but a Premier League football club. And I think that was something that really shone through as I read through the book.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, but I think I would have a lot of sympathy for their position from the outset. Once they decided that they felt that they had to sanction Roman Abramovich, and if you take away the rationale behind that, once that decision was made, I think they had an awful lot to do very quickly. And I think, having spoken to a few of the a couple of very senior sanctions lawyers who work in private practice in the UK, their experiences of what happened across that time were that um, the government had such a vast task. They had to obviously deal with everything. Clearly, that's their job. But from every kind of industry, companies from all over the world, and they're sort of fielding requests, and they were saying that the pace of the situation was startling for them, in that they were receiving sort of hourly email updates where the position was changing markedly. So I think in a similar fashion to us as journalists, thinking we're struggling to keep pace with the news cycle, I think people who are working in it behind the scenes were having a similar kind of experience. Um, and I think so. I would have some sympathy for the government struggling to sort of get to terms with everything they had to deal with. But yes, I think it took them probably too long to understand, to comprehend the detail of some of the license constraints that. You could see the rationale of wanting to ensure that the sanctions were actually a punishment, but in the end, clearly that didn't really have any effect on Roman Abramovich. That had an effect on um, staff and players at Chelsea, Chelsea fans, businesses in the borough that have that clearly have that only really exist because of Chelsea. And I mean, I've only found this out recently, but somebody was telling me that there's something like 500 businesses in the borough that wouldn't exist if Chelsea didn't exist, and that a lot of those
Yeah.
are obviously be match day based, but wider than that. And if you think about 500 businesses, that's got to be upwards of 1,000 jobs. So it was much wider, wasn't it, than just simply making sure that the man who was sanctioned was suitably constrained. And so I think, yeah, it took the government probably too long to realise the repercussions of what they'd done. And to their credit, they did make changes, but they probably could have foreseen all of this in the first place. So I think, yeah, it created a lot of distress and worry for people, and then it took an awful long time for a lot of that to be undone.
Do you think there could have been any other alternative? It's so easy in hindsight now to look back. Mainly, I'm referencing the funds that still haven't been resolved
Mm,
in terms of
yeah,
being sent to victims of the war, the humanitarian effort, which you detail extensively, which I think is, again, another part of the book that maybe I think really does reveal a lot in terms of like the context. I mean, but I think it's easy for me to sit here, obviously with my biased Chelsea hat, and go, well, could it have turned out a different way? But like
yeah.
there it kind of feels you do get a sense of political pressure, especially kind of building up to this very quick decision, basically, that then has ramifications.
I think that probably in hindsight, um, and it is in hindsight. I think that the imposition of the May 31 deadline was unnecessary, and I think that created a lot of the problems. If the government had given themselves and Chelsea more time, then that would have taken a lot of pressure off the situation. I can understand why they did that, because they wanted it to be, they wanted to show strength. They wanted to show that they were doing something decisive and swift. But I think the reality is trying to condense a sale of that magnitude into 3 months, when it, under normal circumstances, would have taken a year. That just created more problems than it solved, and I think, yeah. So in hindsight, I think that probably would have been something that could have helped a great deal. And yeah, and I think that um, the sanctions were political, and that's fine. That's I don't think that's up for sort of debate, really, and that's perfectly reasonable. I think everyone involved would see that as being perfectly reasonable. Obviously, then Chelsea becomes stuck in the middle of that. And that's definitely something that Roman Abramovich always wanted to avoid. And he wanted to sort of keep Chelsea separate from politics, and keep himself separate from politics as much as possible. And obviously that then became impossible in this situation. And then I think that, I mean, in terms of what happens next with that money, if you're taking away the details and the nuances aside, I think there's a lot of people who still hope that that will be able to go to the humanitarian effort and to make a massive difference. It could still be transformative for the whole humanitarian sector, and I think that is a hope and an aim that I would really hope could transcend politics. But I appreciate that's quite potentially a trite thing to say, and that maybe it can't. But I think it's worthy of having retaining that kind of aim, because if that money were to be released, then it could really have a massive impact on millions of people.
I guess like one of the biggest things, and you said it right at the start in terms of making this book what it is obviously being able to speak to Roman Abramovich and being able to speak to someone who's what not just one of the biggest and instrumental figures in Chelsea history, but one of the biggest and instrumental figures in football history, especially English football history as well. Um, in terms of getting that opportunity and being able to speak to him, and especially with the gap of a couple of years, especially I think that if I remember rightly, there's kind of two interviews, one in
Yeah.
24, if I remember rightly, one in
Hmm.
20,
Yeah.
maybe as recent as 25. How were those interviews, and I guess just maybe the feeling you got from him because so much apart from Chelsea has happened, but obviously this thing that was a huge moment and a huge part of his life as well. Maybe reflecting on that with some, I guess, somberness, I guess, is maybe the best way to describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. Yes, I first time I saw him was Istanbul in January 2024, and then again in Abu Dhabi in January 2025. And I think that clearly he wanted the opportunity eventually to to kind of square the circle by giving his side of the story, and that's something that I guess I'd always talk very loosely with some of his trusted advisors about, and then eventually that they decided that that would be something they wanted to do, and I was lucky enough that they asked me to do it, and I'd sort of always made that offer, so they knew that offer was there. It was kind of an open ended thing, and so yeah, and when it did happen, I mean, both meetings were remarkable. Him and his openness, and he was very happy to, from the outset, he stressed that it was an ask me anything situation, and so we covered everything in at length, and yeah, I think he's interesting that he would be clear on this, and everyone around him would say the same thing: is that he only tends to look forward, so he doesn't really dwell on things. So it was unusual for him to kind of look back, but I think it was important for him to do that as well. But yeah, I mean, basically, I think he's quite well. He's a massive realist, and so he's quite sort of phlegmatic around the whole thing. He's definitely clearly, um, he was obviously upset about having to sell Chelsea, but understanding of the situation, and also I think very proud of his time as owner of the club, and feeling like everything that he achieved and his team achieved in that period of time is something that the legacy remains, doesn't it? So I think that is a big thing.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and so remarkable, really, sort of hearing from him firsthand about why he bought the club, how he came to do that in the first place, and how they sort of turned it into the powerhouse it was, and just genuinely that when he was talking about all of that, something that really struck me was his body language, his the things that, not just the words he was saying, but how he was saying them, his body language, just the whole feel of it. You could tell he really cared about Chelsea, and he loved it, and that he grew into becoming a real football and Chelsea fan. So I think that's something that as a fellow football fan, you can see that in people, can't you? When it's genuine, you know what I mean. We all know who's sort of genuine about their love for a club, or perhaps is maybe not so, is a bit more casual, and there's nothing wrong with that, is there either? But you could really tell that it was legitimate from the way he was talking about all of it.
in terms of the contrast, because obviously you got to speak to Boehly as well,
Mm,
and I do wonder what that contrast is like, because again, you're talking to someone obviously directly influenced with all of this, but someone who has become really a household football name in the space of a couple of years, and another massive figure in Chelsea history. Just reflections on kind of speaking to him, because I guess it's so different between those two figures as well, because
yeah.
Roman was part of the defining trait of his was his quietness, was his
Mm,
he wasn't public, and it was assuming what he thought about situations for about 20 years. Of course, with
mm,
Bowley it's the complete opposite. We have been able to gain a lot of information from listening to him even before joining Chelsea. So I just
yeah.
wonder, as the author, and being able to look at this picture, what that experience was like.
Yeah, no, I think it was great, and it was really very, very helpful of Todd to to give his time and to contribute to the project. And I think clearly he did that because I'd already spoken to Roman Abramovich, and I think that he knew, the point when I sort of approached, Todd and his people and asked if he would do it. The project was, absolutely happening. I had the publishing deal. I'd already interviewed Roman Abramovich, once with plans to interview him again. So everything was extremely advanced, and I think um, it's not something that Todd would have sought, but also given that it was being written, he wanted to make sure that this would be, an accurate account of everything that happened. And so that was really important. So I'm very grateful to him for doing that because that's what I wanted it to be as well. And so, within that, I think there is a lot of sort of commonality between them in the way they would approach things, being decisive, being quick thinking, trying to be agile, and they both have this air of calmness. And I suppose that makes sense because they're in control of an awful lot of things in their lives. Um, but yeah, Todd is somebody who you can see he's determined to make this a success for Chelsea for the long run, and somebody that and I think probably where they differ is that given Todd's business interests, he has to be more vocal and more visible than Roman Abramovich did, and I think that's probably also something that's a sign of the times as well. Because Abramovich was probably the first person, the first of the super owners, if we like, and he had
Yeah.
complete ownership and therefore control of Chelsea. So he and his leadership team could be small and but very agile as well, and very they obviously could rule everything completely, could govern, and so that meant that decisions could be very quick, couldn't they? But I think the way football has changed, the way the Premier League has changed off the back of what Roman Abramovich has done, means that and the scale of the investment that I think owners see coming again, it means that actually
Yeah.
some of these entities, they have a structure like a multinational corporation, don't they? And I think we're going to see that more and more. And I think that probably means we'll see that there'll be fewer such enterprises around the world, even where one person can be in charge. And so that then means that people have more people, more influential people to satisfy. And obviously, Todd's money is his own money, which I think is important to stress. That he's invested in Chelsea, which is a really good thing for the club, I think, because that makes it a very personal investment. I think it's always good if a club has at least one of the major shareholders that put their own money into things, because they are putting their own money where their mouth is, aren't they? And that's a good thing, hopefully. But also, it's becoming increasingly difficult for one person to have total control with their own money, and that's where like a Badadek Barley and a Clear Lake and Jose Feliciano come in, because the power through their huge fund that Clear Lake bring really underpins all everything that Chelsea are doing. And but within that, obviously, Clear Lake have investors to satisfy and all sorts of other things. So and also obviously Todd has that through Eldridge, his own company that's sort of clearly separate to Chelsea. But I think when people are in a business at that level and they have those sorts of concerns, they have to talk, don't they? Really. So of course, in doing that, then they'll talk about Chelsea. But yeah, he was definitely determined that while he wanted to help, he didn't want his contributions to sort of overshadow anything else, which I thought was a very respectful way of going about things. And I think even though he does talk, my view on it, in this and in other things, my view on it would be that I don't think Todd talks too much. I don't think he says too much, but I think it's also quite hard to get that balance right, isn't it? In
Yeah.
the media landscape, online and print and everything that we're in. I think it's probably quite hard to balance speaking enough and frequently enough, and making sure that you keep your counsel on certain things that can't be public.
Yeah, the I think what's quite wonderful about it, there are two you kind of parallel kind of difference in the way the takeovers happened, of like how Roman Abramovich, some people were taking photos with him and didn't even know who he was in 2003. And then I remember at the time, I think it was the night before the Wolves game, when that photo dropped of Todd Boehly and George Osborne. I think I can't remember who else was there, but there was a few of them. Especially Boehly was kind of the big name at the time. Were there, and they clearly were just on the brink of getting the deal done. And I think it's kind of a reflection, isn't it, of how, especially the social media age, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, whatever it is, how much more obsessed people are about the owners than they were 20 years ago. Right? Whether you say that's a good or bad thing, I mean, I think it's probably a good thing that people are more engaged and care about their ownership, and who's actually running the club. I think is a positive thing. But I do agree with you that there is that difference, right, in that balancing act, because people want honesty. I think they want accountability. But yeah, if you speak too much, as we've seen with Boehly, it kind of makes him kind of there's a perception of Boehly, right, quite a negative one that's out there already. I do just wanted another figure, and it was one of the funnier parts of the book that I don't want to don't want to give away everything about the book, because people should absolutely go and read it. But it was about one Jim Ratcliffe, and his quite late rush to try and bid for Chelsea, in this quite hilarious meeting, at least from me, from my perspective, with Bruce Buck, and this paper that he had in his pocket that was being asked to be taken out, but was never taken out, apparently. Can you just explain how you came across that story in
Yeah.
itself? I mean, now what we know about Ratcliffe with Man United, I mean, it does kind of illuminate him as a character compared to, say, Bowley.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing to say is, it quite quickly, a lot of people's reading of Jim Ratcliffe's behaviour at the time. I think what you could say is that it did feel like he was almost trying to signpost publicly that he was in the market to buy a football club. And I think that really, and let's talk with hindsight here now, but I think it's clear that all along that club was Manchester United. And I think that, behind the scenes, a few of us were speculating, sort of thinking, is he trying to make a statement here to the Glazers that, that he's ready and he's serious and he's got the money, to buy the club he wants to buy because he's a Manchester United fan. Um, at the time, obviously, um, he was in the initial conversations when Rainbank were trying to, very early on, starting the process. So he had initial conversations with Rainbank about, they asked him if he wanted to bid for Chelsea, and he considered it, but he and his people decided not to enter the formal process. So they said no at that point. But I think there were still a lot of people who were quite surprised that Britain's richest man didn't want to have any, it wasn't even interested at sort of progressing that. And then obviously at the 11th hour, he sort of emerged, and he and Ineos, made it clear that they wanted to be considered as bidding for Chelsea and make a bid for Chelsea. So he asked for a meeting with Bruce Buck and got that meeting, and that was in the boardroom at Stamford Bridge. And so at which point, Jim Ratcliffe was sort of tapping his breast pocket, his shirt pocket. He said, in my pocket there's a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper is my bid for Chelsea. And so Bruce Buck was saying, okay, great. What's the bit? What's the number, please? Then and rather than say either take the piece of paper out or say what the number was, Jim Ratcliffe kind of just sort of launched into his pitch for Chelsea, saying it's the only all British bid and those sorts of things. And I think it was, I think a few people in the room, I think Bruce Buck was saying, come on, what's the number? And I don't think they ever got to that point. But I think, eventually, Ineos and Jim Ratcliffe were told, look, you've bypassed the process. So everyone who's gone through the process, like the Ricketts and Boehly, Barley, and Clearlake and the others, they've spent millions of pounds on all the due diligence, going through all the information in the data room, and presenting. So the bidders, when they got down to the final stages, this was the point it was at. It was basically when Jim Ratcliffe did this, it was on the point of the shortlist being confirmed, basically. So it was the very final stages of the bid. Actually, well, it's even later than that. Sorry, but I mean, so it was really at the final hour, and so the process was basically concluded, all but. And so, but they hadn't, obviously, Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos hadn't taken part in that process. So the first thing that obviously Bruce Buck and others were saying was, look, the other bidders will be, sort of fuming if, if somebody comes in, from the side at this point. But also, the only way that really could be reasonably considered is if the bid is significantly higher than the other bids, and in the end, it wasn't. I think it was sort of relatively commensurate with the other numbers, and so obviously it eventually rejected out of hand. And I think that Chelsea felt that they had to entertain the approach, even though they didn't really think it was sensible to come, on the rails the way Ineos did. But yeah, I think obviously very very quickly the bid was rejected out of hand, and then the Boehly Barley consortium, won out. So it was it was slightly strange, yeah. But I think lots of people feel that it was only ever really an attempt to sort of do some talking with communicating with the Glazers in public, to just kind of signpost the fact that that Jim Ratcliffe was sort of wanting to buy a football club, and obviously being a a United fan, that would be the club that would be the best fit.
Yeah, I think that despite the criticisms of the Clear Lake Bowley ownership that have been had by many, including myself, since the takeover, I think there are many looking at the way things have gone at Man United so far and kind of breathing a sigh of relief of what could have been. So I felt that was quite funny. But thank you so much, Nick, for joining me. Just one quick question before we go here. I mean, obviously, this is your first book. It's about Chelsea, and you spoke earlier about sort of an extensive career of covering Chelsea. Are there any other parts of Chelsea history that you maybe are looking at and thinking that could be the sequel book?
Well, I'm not sure really. I mean, I think it's. I think I don't have any particular plans at this point in that, unfortunately. But obviously, I'm still looking around and seeing what's next. But I think it is fascinating, just in itself, how the club has developed over time. If you think, obviously, Ken Bates, his ownership was so crucial to a lot of development anyway, and obviously, towards the end of his time, the club was in a difficult position. But he's another, you know, um, huge figure in football, isn't he? And everything he's done. And I think just generally I think what's fascinating looking back now is the period of time when the Premier League, took English football to another level. And I think actually the time that's going to come now will be probably just as fascinating, if not more so again, because as we're seeing with, if you think about the Sir Martin Broughton bid, and they had, Harrison Blitzer as the big financial backers. Well, obviously they went on and bought the Washington Commanders for an even bigger sum than was paid for Chelsea, and now obviously the Lakers have been bought for an unreal number. If we think about it, elite
Yeah,
sport around the world, especially in the US and the UK, there's an awful lot of people who see uh, another level of growth that's probably similar to what the Premier League has already experienced. And I saw, if the Premier League has had one boom, maybe it's going to have another. And so then, you know, I think it'd be fascinating to see what happens if there is another boom, because I don't know about you, but if you look at the caliber of uh, that's required for a player to be a Premier League regular, it's almost frightening how good someone has to be to not just to get into a Premier League team but stay there. And then that's before you
yeah,
think about the very best of the best. And so I think there are always some elements around a romantic side of a sport that are lost when the ultra professionalism, keeps taking steps forward. But I think overall the product is, obviously vastly improved, and I think it's, hugely to the credit of those individuals and the organisations that produce them, that they can get to those levels. And so, if it all does jump on again, I'm not sure where we'll be in 5, 10, 15 years in terms of, off field, but especially also on, how good can the players be? And, what's the next big sort of tactical shift, obviously, after, what Pep Guardiola's done. There'll be another one soon at some point, won't there? And you sort of think, so I think that probably, even though it hasn't happened yet, maybe that's the thing will be the most fascinating, because I don't think there's many people at the top end of the sport or looking at investing in the top end of the sport who see any limits really, and I think that's remarkable.
No, absolutely. I think with the way Chelsea ownership and especially the American ownership very much becoming a dominant thing now across the Premier League is something to look at, along with concerns still about a European Super League or something in that mold and fashion of how that could come, and whether the resistance will be the same and as effective as it was. So yeah, I think that absolutely, how for better or worse, we're going to see how the Premier League comes about, and whether it can, as you say, go to another boom again. But thank you so much, Nick. The the inside story of Chelsea sale is now available. I definitely suggest and encourage everyone listening, watching this, please go and check it out. It's available. I'm a Kindle reader. I do like the physical books, but just because of my fiance would be quite mad at me with all the books that I have to keep and store somewhere. That's why I've moved to a Kindle. But you can get it on Kindle and obviously physical as well. So go and check it out. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. Follow across the socials at SonOfChelsea. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again very, very soon. All the best.